The shelling started before dawn and did not stop. In the dim red of Malinta Tunnel, a private from the 59th Coast Artillery cupped his hands to catch dust as it shook from the ceiling, then brushed it from his mess tin and ate anyway. The tunnel smelled like damp limestone, sweat, carbolic soap, and cooked rice that had been stretched with anything the cooks could find. Someone had chalked a calendar on the wall and stopped crossing off days because the days no longer mattered. When the next shell hit, the floor kicked under their boots and the overhead bulbs flickered, and every man in the wardroom waited for the pop of the breakers that would send them into dark. Outside, Corregidor looked smaller than the maps had promised. The Rock, they had told them in Manila, the last anchor in the mouth of the bay, ringed with guns. Now the guns were scarred and gouged. The slopes were shaved bare by splinters, and trees stood like snapped masts. At Battery Way, crews hunched around 12-inch mortars and loaded by feel. The recoil shoved the weapons back on worn carriages. Men had learned to keep cat litter and sand handy to soak the oil that sprayed when the seals blew. Each shot was a grunt, a shove, a lunge. Then they listened for the delayed crack from Baton's far shore and the thin cheer that sometimes followed when a shell found a Japanese battery. The men had watched Baton fall in April. They had seen the fires, the columns of smoke, heard the guns stop one by one. Some had friends there. Rumors came with the tide. Beaten units, captured hospitals, prisoners marched north with bayonets at their backs. On Corregidor, the order was simple. Hold. General Wainwright walked the line with a narrow set to his mouth, careful with words, steady with his eyes. MacArthur had gone south weeks earlier under orders. The men knew it, said little, and kept loading shells. Food thinned. Breakfast meant rice and coffee that tasted like rust. At noon, sometimes a ladle of watery stew with shreds of carabao meat. Cigarettes were cigarettes until they were not, and then they were shredded rope and paper. Men learned to sleep anywhere. Nurses worked in white that would not stay white. They cut bandages from bed sheets and wrote names on tags with pencil because ink ran in the damp. When the generator faltered, they held flashlights in their teeth to suture, and the wounded watched the beam tremble with every breath. The bombardment shifted in May from harassment to demolition. Japanese guns and howitzers massed on the Cavite shore. The air raids came thick and methodical. Bombs fell in strings that walked across the island, middle side, top side, the barracks, the docks. The water towers went first. Then the command post took a direct hit that peeled the roof like a can lid. Men who had been neat with brass were now neat with splints and morphine. They learned the shape of earth they trusted, the corner of a parapet, the leeward side of a wall, the narrow scoop of a trench that felt like a grave, but wasn't. Not yet. On the night of May 5th, the island seemed to hold its breath. The sea lay dark except for the blink of artillery flashes from the mainland. Then, the northern shore lit with gunfire. Scouts at North Point reported boats. Low, blunt shapes knifing through surf. Searchlights clawed at rain. Machine guns opened. Tracers stitched red and white across water and hit men who stood anyway because the tripod had to be carried and the belt had to be fed. The first wave grounded on rocks and coral, men spilling into shallows, rifles held high. A second wave followed, then a third, under shell bursts that threw water in high white fans. Infantrymen from the 4th Marines met them at the beach. It was savage and close. Grenades rolled among boulders and rang like bells when they bounced off stone. A corporal who had not slept in 2 days fired a Thompson until the barrel smoked and the magazine ran dry, then went to a Springfield. The Japanese formed up behind a knoll and felt for the flanks, then pushed through a gap cut by bombs earlier. Tanks came off the landing craft and clanked inland, short-barreled and squat, their tracks grinding over driftwood and bodies both. A demolition squad heaved satchel charges and watched one tank stagger and stop, its crew wrenching at the hatch, smoke pink in the headlight beams. By midnight, the line wavered. By 2, it bent. Communications went bad. Runners crawled because it was the only way to stay alive, between one rock and the next. A radio set sputtered and died under a sheet of shrapnel. At Battery Geary, a magazine explosion hurled concrete the size of trucks across the slope. Men at a nearby aid post felt the heat on their faces and did not know from which direction it came. Mortar crews worked by pocket watch and memory, afraid to fire too far forward because the front had dissolved and their own Marines were out there somewhere in the dark. Dawn did not bring clarity. It brought gray light that flattened everything and showed how few were left unhit. Wainwright's staff counted ammunition, a handful of mortar rounds, rifle clips scattered in pockets, machine gun belts wet with seawater. The tanks ground closer, their engines a steady growl. Officers looked at each other and saw the same sums: no ships coming, no air cover, no fresh positions, only the tunnel and what it contained. Somewhere up the slope, a chaplain finished a prayer and closed his book in both hands like he feared it would fall apart. At noon on May 6th, Wainwright decided he would spare the island the last 30 minutes of slaughter. He sent word up and down the line, and men who had been fighting through 2 nights felt something give way in their chests. White flags took shape from bedsheets, undershirts, any cloth that would show. A Marine lieutenant stood up on a shattered wall and waved until a bullet snapped the staff, and he waved what was left. On the north shore, men laid rifles on the ground and stepped back because the habit of holding them was too strong to break without a ritual. In Malinta Tunnel, the operating team stopped in place, hands above a chest they would now close, and listened to silence spread as if someone had put a lid on the island. Surrender did not mean safety. The Japanese herded prisoners into groups under guard. Officers were separated from enlisted. The wounded were counted and counted again. Men left without water in the sun fainted and were kicked to standing. A few tried to slip into brush and were shot where the brush began. By evening, the march started, short at first, then longer as men were ferried to the railhead and shipped to holding pens at Bilibid or Cabanatuan. They learned new rules: bow when ordered, do not meet an officer's eyes, work until told to stop. Men who had known coast artillery became stevedores, cane cutters, quarry hands. Disease took those who could not find shade or salt or hope when they were rationed thin. Time thinned, too. There were forms of transport the prisoners learned to fear, the crowded holds of ships with no Red Cross painted on them, the hatches battened, air bad, heat worse. Later, they would learn the word hell ships, but not then. Then they just knew that a man could enter a hold with 200 others, and not all would climb the ladder again. Some were bombed by accident at anchor. Some limped to Formosa or Japan and unloaded to factories and mines. A few looked back from a rail at a sea that had once meant escape and now meant distance without promise. The rock itself grew quiet after. Guns lay in pieces where they had been. The slope grassed over in the wet seasons. A boot heel sank and filled with rain, and made a mark that lasted a week and then didn't. Names crossed the ocean in letters that reached no one. A nurse remembered the last operation under flashlight and kept the memory like a shard. A Marine remembered the way a helmet sounded when a wave rolled it down the stones and swore he would never live near a beach again. A gunner recalled the feel of a mortar tube hot under his glove, the exact weight of a round, and found himself lifting soup pots at home as if they might kick back in recoil. When the war turned, the men who survived prisons and mines began to come back, thin as rope and quiet in ways their families did not expect. They learned who had not made it. They learned where the ships had gone down and which camps had been abandoned and what had been saved at the last minute by luck and the luck of others. Some returned to Corregidor with the liberation and stood on the slopes, now bright with sun, and looked toward the mainland at the same angles they had watched for boats the night the island was taken. They did not talk much while standing there. There was too much to say and too little time to say it correctly. The men who held Corregidor did what training told them to do. They kept the guns firing, kept the wounded alive, and kept the lines tied together until there was nothing left to tie. They watched the bay for help that never came, and the sky for cover that didn't appear, and stepped into surrender with their hands visible, because that was what would keep most men breathing through the next hour. They endured because the alternative was to stop. Years later, in quiet kitchens and VFW halls, the story came out in straight lines. The tunnel, the guns, the landings, the white flags, the march, the camps, the ships. It was not a complicated story. It was heavy. On the rock there are markers now, and tourists stand where the gun crews stood. If you close your eyes in the heat, the island tells the same tale the men told without flourish. The ground shook. We loaded. They came. We held. We couldn't. We lived. That is the size of it and the truth of it from a soldier's view. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.